Okay.
Sandy is still outside. Tell Sandy Vashbal to come in.
I think he knows what we think already.
That's true. There's nothing I have to say that will surprise you.
Very well. So we are ready to start our fourth and last session. You have the disadvantage of having to bear with me as a chair for a second time, but you have the big advantage of having another excellent panel to share their insights and exchange views with you on another very difficult theater when it comes to Europe's security, that is looking at instability and order in Eastern Europe. Clearly, European security order has entered a very precarious phase. There have been, of course, signals of complications and crises over the years, but the crisis, the conflict in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, have certainly been a turning point when it comes to European security, or one may say insecurity. It has certainly sharpened perception. It has created alienation. It has degraded in a very significant way relations between the US, Europe, and Russia. It has led to a geopolitical standoff that we see at play in Eastern Europe, and to much more difficult mutual relations and mutual perceptions. So we are certainly in a complicated situation. Many people argue that relations between Russia, Europe, and the US have been touching their lowest point since the end of the Cold War. There are some observers who fear the revival of bipolar confrontation in Europe and beyond. So we are at a very particular moment in time, and one that requires clear assessment, clear analysis, and cold heads to deal with this sensitive situation. This is why I'm very happy to be able to share views today with Jeffrey Manco from CSIS, James Sher from Chatham House, and my colleague Paul Ivan from the European Policy Center. And perhaps if I could start, I would ask you to give us a little bit your sense of what is your assessment of the situation that we're looking at, of the crisis that we are looking at. Is this something that is related to the particular circumstances of the conflict in Ukraine? Is this something more structural, more systemic? It is a geopolitical confrontation. It is a matter of balancing dialogue and cooperation. What is the nature of the issue when we look at the security order in Eastern Europe and in Europe more broadly? That would be my first question, to then look at more specific issues. Perhaps, James, do you wanna start?
Fine, thank you. I mean, to start directly with Russia, by now it is a structural and systemic issue. We have a deeply antagonistic relationship, and it is not going to disappear or improve very soon. I would say it will not change its character as long as the present setup in Russia and the present occupants, the present system of power in Russia remains. I would describe it as a fundamental geopolitical and civilizational discord, because there's a normative element here. And to permissively simplify, it is a division between adherence to a security order in Europe based on the principles of Helsinki, which are the principles that are based on the equality of states, their independence, their sovereignty, their freedom of choice, and a Yalta paradigm of security, which is based on a belief in the equality of great states, the limited sovereignty of small states, and the recognition of clear spheres of influence between them. And this did not start in 2014. It didn't even start with Vladimir Putin. It is a divergence which emerged and matured cumulatively and gradually, beginning in the mid-1990s. But it has acquired particular virulence in the last few years. And I would just, before concluding, just mention two aspects of this. By now, those who run Russia, and I would say Russians as a whole, and what we loosely call the West, and I include Europe and the United States in this, really live in different realities. In Russia, there is a belief that the country faces an integrated, coherent threat assessment based on issues that we tend to regard as separate: NATO and EU enlargement, colored revolutions, military intervention by the West, and regime change. This is all seen in Russia as part of a coherent, orchestrated Western policy. And that threat perception has effectively in Russia become unchallengeable. No amount of reality or evidence of factual discussion is going to alter any of this, except on the fringes. The second factor, and this is a very serious reality for all of us and for practitioners, is that today, unlike the 1990s, even like the early part of this century, even like Putin's first term and a half, the hard guys are in power in Russia. And what I mean by that is that they only respect interlocutors who are strong, who understand their strengths, who know their own interests, who know what they are doing and know how they are doing it. They do not respect niceness. They are insulted by appeals, certainly insulted by appeals to common principles and common values. They are not impressed by demonstrations of how eager we are to cooperate with them. And so we are dealing with people who describe themselves as pragmatic. And Putin's very clear about what pragmatism means. It means the strict, straightforward promotion of Russian national interests, irrespective of whether you approve of it or you don't approve of it, or you like us or you don't like us. Being liked is absolutely irrelevant. So this is the Russia I think we're dealing with today, and will continue to be dealing with. My very last point is that I think, for all these reasons, talk in the West about changing Russian behavior is rather fanciful. What we can aim to do is constrain Russia's behavior, and that's different from changing the essence of what it is.
So, James, pretty stark view between Helsinki and Yalta, a sort of systemic change, deeply rooted. That is the way you have sketched out in clear terms the situation. Jeff, what is your reading of this situation?
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, also I want to thank EPC and the U.S. mission for sponsoring this conference and for having us here, and to all of you for sticking it out to this point in the afternoon. In answer to your question, originally you posed the problem as a problem of order, and I think that's the right way to look at it, because fundamentally the problem is one of diverging views of what the nature of the European security order should be. And I think James is right, a lot of this goes back to the 1990s, but there's been a structural problem in figuring out where Russia fits in that European security order. The idea that we eventually settled on at the end of the Cold War was one in which institutions that were created during the Cold War, NATO and then what became the EU, became the overall framework for managing multilateral problems, including security problems in Europe. And it was never entirely clear how Russia was going to fit into that framework. Now, different attempts were made at different points during the 1990s to come up with some kind of arrangements. You know, there's the Partnership for Peace and the Permanent Joint Council and the NATO-Russia Council and the European Neighborhood Policy and all of these things. But none of them ever resolved this challenge. You know, Russia felt that it was too big to be just another member of these institutions. These institutions felt that Russia was too big to take in anyway. A lot of the members were worried about, you know, where Russia was going to fit if it were admitted anyway. So, you know, I'm a historian by training, and I always kind of think of things in terms of historical trajectories and historical analogies. And I think you can make an analogy between you know, the way that Germany was handled at the end of the First World War versus the way Germany was handled at the end of the Second World War, right? And after the First World War, Germany's defeated, European order is reconstructed, but Germany remains on the outside of it. And of course, we know how that ends. After the Second World War, again, Germany's defeated, the European security order is reconstructed. This time, at least, the western part of Germany is successfully integrated into that order. And so it's a much happier story. I think there was a failure in the early 1990s, perhaps, to come up with a creative solution to how that new order should be restructured such that Russia was part of it rather than on the outside of it. Now, that doesn't absolve Russia for all of the things that have happened since then, and I think James is right in laying out some of the very detrimental shifts in both Russian geopolitical thinking and Russian domestic politics that have happened over the last decade plus, you know, where instead of trying to figure out how do you work through a suboptimal structural arrangement, you've had a Russia that has become increasingly revisionist towards that arrangement and has decided that it would rather see the failure of this order and the reconstruction of something else that does look a lot more like Yalta. And that has entailed not only pushing back to try and prevent countries like Georgia and Ukraine from consolidating their membership in Euro-Atlantic institutions. It's also, as we've seen in the last couple of years, come to undermining support for the whole notion of Euro-Atlantic institutions and Euro-Atlantic solidarity within countries that are already members, both in Europe and the United States. And so in that sense, Russia has become, over the last, I would say, decade, certainly since Putin's return to power in 2012, has become an openly revisionist power vis-a-vis this order that was constructed at the end of the Cold War. And that presents a very stark proposition for supporters of that order, because up to this point, I think our paradigm has been that we're going to look for a way to anchor Russia to that order. We're going to come up with some kind of institutional bridge to tie Russia to it. But I think what's happened over the last several years has been that Russia has effectively announced that it's not interested in that kind of a bridging arrangement, and it seeks something more fundamental in terms of rewriting the rules and institutions of European and transatlantic security.
Thank you, Jeff. So a phase in the 90s of uncertainty on all sides on how to deal with a very new situation, a systemic paradigm shift in Europe and beyond, of course, with the end of the Cold War. And then in the last decade or more, actually a shift in Russia's attitude towards a West that, as James put, Russia sees in very large terms as somehow intent on sort of expanding its influence in ways that Russia considers unacceptable. Paul, there is the European Union, which has, of course, sought to engage Russia through its own frameworks, various sort of partnership frameworks, a strategic partnership. There is a dimension, of course, of interdependence, which is very relevant between Europe and Russia. What do you make? What do you make of these situations? What are your comments following James and Jeff?
Thank you, Giovanni. Now, obviously, there's a lot of agreement between us in terms of the historical development in the 90s, in terms of the partially failure to reimagine or to reform the European security framework and a certain degradation. But I would say what we can also see is a shift in how Russia sees the behavior, and as we are in Brussels, of the European Union. Now, obviously, we knew that they opposed the NATO enlargement, and they've been vocal at times up to different degrees towards the different waves of NATO enlargement. But up until 2012, 2013, let's say to the return of President Putin to the presidency of Russia, they haven't been vocal in criticizing and opposing the various plans and frameworks that the EU was putting forward for the countries in between, the countries that we call now of the Eastern Partnership. And that was a shift. That was a visible shift that happened there. That then led to an increase of tensions, and as we know, to developments in Crimea, in eastern Ukraine. Now, if Russia was not looking at those EU initiatives through that geopolitical prism, or was not very vocal about it, the EU was almost completely ignoring it. It was ignoring, let's say, the sort of way Russia could look at the EU initiatives, at the EU association agreement with those countries, which then tended to be seen as really the EU taking these countries out from Russia's zone of influence. It was a very stark awakening. I would say the EU still tends to ignore partially the sort of geopolitical considerations. It has, of course, imposed sanctions. It has criticized, it has condemned Russia's behavior, but it largely continues to go along with its policies in the region. One of the reasons for that is also the diversity of views inside the EU. We talked about different threat assessments or about the commonalities and that on the two sides of the Atlantic. But if we look at this side of the Atlantic, we see that we have 28 member states. They do not see Russia in the same way. For some of them, it is almost an existential threat. If we look at the countries, especially the countries closer to Russia. For some, it's an irritant, a challenge. For others, it still is, in a good way, a key economic partner. And it's a very mixed picture. Obviously, the EU has managed quite a lot, I would say, given this situation. It has managed to maintain a united front. It has 5 principles to deal with the current crisis with Russia. But it's still, I would say, not on the same page. I mean, we can look at many indications for that, from public opinion to the number of visits to Moscow or summits with the Russian president, to the support for new sanctions or different measures. And there are reasons for that. I mean, there are obvious reasons to that, having to do again with geographical position, historical relations, culture, religion in some cases, and so forth.
So yeah, we this morning in the first panel there was a couple of references to the differences in perception, priorities, approaches between Eastern and Western Europe. Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe, Southern Europe. Clearly, there are different sensitivities, and yet there has been a significant amount, and perhaps unexpected amount, of cohesion and solidarity in the face of the crisis, in particular in Ukraine and in the aftermath, in taking a common stance towards Russia across the Atlantic, within the European Union and across the Atlantic. Now, that has been a matter of politics of sanctions, that has been a matter of strengthening NATO's presence in Eastern Europe. Clearly, we know, as you mentioned, Paul, that at the same time, there are different assessments and there are different perceptions of the sort of challenge that Russia poses to the European security order. Perhaps, what is your view, Jeff, perhaps to begin with, as to the strength, the resilience of the transatlantic position as it stands now? And on top of that also, whether you think that that is a position, regardless of its actual strength and resilience, that can be sustained over time, that can be productive over time, that can be effective over time. Part of the answer probably depends also on the diagnosis of the crisis that you have provided.
Yeah, I think there has long been concern that transatlantic unity would weaken over the response, in particular to the conflict in Ukraine, that sanctions, particularly the EU sanctions that are up for revision every 6 months, would eventually come to a breaking point, and that you'd see some kind of fracture across the Atlantic over how to respond to this crisis because of the differing geographic and economic issues. That hasn't happened so far, and I think that's a testament to both the shared threat assessment that exists on both sides of the Atlantic and to the success of the diplomacy of administrations. And you know, I don't like giving credit to the Trump administration, but I think both the Obama and Trump administrations have done a reasonable job about ensuring that transatlantic unity is maintained on this particular issue, and in responding cohesively to the Russian challenge. I think also they've been aided in that by Russia's own behavior. Russian saber rattling, the Skripal attack in the UK, I think have galvanized transatlantic support for maintaining a united front vis-a-vis Russia in a way that maybe one couldn't necessarily take for granted under other circumstances. As far as the durability of that unity, I would say a couple of things. One is, of course, a lot depends on Russia. If Russia continues to act in a highly provocative way, I think you're going to continue to see a general push for transatlantic unity, because there is a sense that this is a shared threat, one that encompasses both traditional security challenges, military harassment, troop movements, and the like, as well as things like electoral interference that have become more of a topic of transatlantic discussion in the last year or so. If there's going to be a fissure across the Atlantic over these issues, I would say that the two potential causes for it are, one, a sudden change in Russian behavior, which doesn't seem particularly likely, but I think we have to at least hold in the realm of possibility over Ukraine or anything else. And second is less a sort of fissure at the transatlantic level than a fissure at the domestic level within one or more countries, either the United States or in Europe, because Russia and responding to Russia has in a lot of ways become a domestic political issue. Something that Russia has fueled, but nevertheless this has become part of the political debate in Washington, in London, in Budapest, in a number of European capitals. And so I think depending on which particular coalition of players finds itself in power at any particular time, you may have greater or lesser degrees of transatlantic unity on this question.
Paul, European Union, you mentioned, has these 5 principles in its approach to Russia, has been seeking to strike a balance between firmness on sanctions, firmness on principled issues about security in Eastern Europe, in the common neighborhood, and at the same time, selective engagement and clearly continuing in sort of pursuing economic relations within the limits that are enabled by the punitive measures. Do you see essentially this position continuing, this sort of balancing act continuing for the sort of short to medium term?
I think that's the most likely scenario indeed. I mean, I don't see any signs that the situation would improve in what concerns the conflict, at least what concerns the conflict in Ukraine. And as we know, the European sanctions are linked to very clearly to the particular conflict. I don't expect that to change in the near future, though I just last evening I saw the draft agreement of the Italian coalition between the Lega Nord and the Five Star Movement that at one point calls for the immediate lifting of the sanctions. Now let's see the final version, and let's see. I would not expect them to stick to that proposals, but actually to join the European mainstream. So I would expect that to continue. I mean, in terms of economic relations, actually we see that despite the sanctions, economic exchanges in some areas, in the energy field, for example, have actually increased. And there are some clear interdependencies there that will remain in place for the foreseeable future. But if I can get back very shortly to your previous question in terms of transatlantic work on this, I actually do see an increase in the differences in how the EU and the US are dealing with Russia, and especially on the issue of sanctions. I work quite a lot on that. If at the beginning of this whole crisis, both parties, both the EU and US, were arguing each time that a new round of sanctions or new measures were adopted, how closely they work together and how coordinated they are, I would say that as Russia's involvement in the electoral process in the US has become clearer, and that has triggered the dynamics inside the US, Washington has tended to take, I would say, stronger measures against Russian companies, Russian individuals, which have not really taken place in Europe. There have been much smaller updates to the European sanctions list. And in a way, it's normal to have these differences. Like we said, EU economies are much more linked to the Russian one than the American one. But I think it's very important to manage these differences, to actually have a dialogue and have the opinion also of the European allies taken into consideration when new decisions are being taken in Washington.
Can I just...
Please, Jeff, and then James on this point.
And just one thing I was going to add that I forgot, since we had a discussion of U.S. and EU differences over Iran sanctions on the previous panel. You know, I would have some concern that should there be a wider rift between the two sides over Iran, one area where you could see a fallout of this is on Russia's sanctions. I think you would have some people in Europe who have been wanting a more collaborative economic relationship with Russia, taking advantage of a wider crisis in U.S.-EU relations triggered by Iran to argue for a loosening of the sanctions.
James.
I want to return to the point that Jeff correctly made, that given all the differences, not only of viewpoints, but of interests in Europe that Paul mentioned, the only way you can explain why there has been the degree of cohesion that we have seen over this period of time has been Russian behavior. And this illustrates the extent to which we and the Russians live in different realities. The Russians have actually been providing support to those who wish to see a return to a strong containment policy in NATO and Europe. And that consensus in many ways, I think, and you and I might differ, is stronger now than in 2014, because we since had, after that, we had the Russian deployment in Syria. We had the whole Aleppo episode, which was not simply a shocking outrage, but which was a commentary on Russian mendacity and diplomatic mendacity, which John Kerry felt very deeply by the end of that process. We have had election manipulation and interference, not only in the United States, but in France and in Germany, and the penetration of the data banks of the Bundestag and so on. And now we've had Skripal. And that means very reluctantly that I think today, even more than 2014, the balance of opinion in Europe is that this problem is very serious and it is not going to go away, great as all the differences are. Now, just there's one flip side to this. I don't think all of this is very good for a country like Ukraine. You see, in 2014 and 2015, the West was very enthusiastic, rightly, about the rapidity with which Ukraine recovered in the midst of this war. The fact that very swiftly most of the gains of the Russian commanded insurgents were rolled back. That a lot of reforms took place, that there was a revolutionary impulse in the country, which lasted 2 years. Well, it's not there now. And the result is, and it's a point I made during my last visit in Ukraine, the West's support of Ukraine today depends now exclusively, is exclusively a function of its apprehension towards Russia, and is not at all based on anything positive about Ukraine at all. And I think we can construct a similar narrative about Moldova, Georgia. There are more positives, but this is not a good situation for the countries of the Eastern neighborhood.
Well, perhaps then let me move to looking at the countries in the Eastern neighborhood, because clearly the geopolitical situation that we have been described is volatile, and we see countries having taken different directions, having expressed different priorities for their political trajectory at home and abroad. Clearly 3 countries, Georgia, Ukraine and Moldova, having signed the CFTAs with the European Union, having undertaken a sort of difficult, strong reform process, having come closer to the European Union and to NATO. Other countries having sort of more multi-vector, shall we say, foreign policy. So this is a region that stands in a difficult geopolitical place, where countries seem to be taking different trajectories, and as you were saying, where the approach of Europe and the US to some of these countries, to some extent, is also a sort of variable of the larger interaction with Russia. But how do you actually see the political trends developing in this region? Where is this region heading to? Where is this region going? Can we speak of a region, or should we speak of individual countries? And if we should speak of individual countries, how do you assess the evolution of the positions of the European Union and the US and Europeans at large towards these countries? Paul, perhaps you wanna start with this.
Yes. Let's say that compared to the start of the Eastern Partnership Initiative, over the years, the European Union has become maybe more realistic, less ambitious in terms of how much you can change those societies. We saw already, 3 years ago with the review of the neighborhood policy, that there's an increased focus on stabilization, on resilience, on strengthening those countries, and this has also evolved due to the, let's say, change or to the fact that it became clear that not all of them were as interested as to develop very close relations with the EU and to adopt EU acquis. And we have this increased differentiation between the 3 that you mentioned that are interested in that. I mean, 7-8 years ago, I was actually working in the team negotiating an association agreement with Azerbaijan, with Armenia. It hasn't happened. Many people have worked. We don't have those agreements. We have different agreements, different degrees in which the EU works with those countries. I would say we need to have a lot of patience. I mean, coming also from a country from Central Eastern Europe, And being also a graduate in history, I can see how long really takes to change and for those societies to reform, to clean corruption, and in order to get to a situation in which they resemble much more an EU country, or what we want to see as an EU country. Now, the main agreements are there in place with the three countries, with Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. I think we still have quite some years ahead of us in terms of implementing those agreements. And I would say soon we should also start thinking what comes after that.
James.
You mentioned the individual aspects and the regional.
Indeed.
Well, I think there's one important commonality shared, at least one, by all the European post-Soviet states. And that is, in different ways, their political systems, their system of governance is all based on a merger between power and money. That was all made easier and almost inevitable because of the particular traumas of the 1990s and the cataclysm of the 1990s and the way this played out, the way the collapse of the Soviet command administrative system played out in different countries. But there are deeper historical factors at work. An absence of any firm understanding and institutional underpinnings for property rights, for sanctity of contract, of a strong middle class with the ethos of a middle class, of a real understanding of what entrepreneurship means in the Western sense, which means business that is entirely independent of the state, not independent of law, but the state, and also, a clear judicial integrity and judicial independence. All these things, for deeper historical factors, even pre-Soviet factors, develop very differently in that part of the world than in most of what we call Central and Western Europe. So that is still there. And then the Russian factor plays out in different ways because Russia is structurally bound in different ways to all these countries in terms of institutions, economic interests, and so on. It is not a pleasant thing to say, but by several measurements, Russian business interests and economic interests in Ukraine today are stronger than they were 2 years ago, although nobody wishes to acknowledge this. The Finnish Institute of International Relations recently published a very well-documented report about this. So, what is the policy conclusion? Well, the policy conclusion should certainly be very sobering when it comes to the realism of becoming EU members anytime soon. But it has no bearing at all on the fundamental issue, which is the fundamental equality of these states as independent entities, the right to make their own choices. The principles of Helsinki, the principles of the UN Charter, don't qualify your entitlement to independence and sovereignty on the basis of how much domestic corruption there is. These are considered rights intrinsic to states as sovereign entities. And so when it comes to the fundamental issues that led us to adopt the policies we did in Ukraine after 2014, they're totally unaffected by this. But when it comes to integration issues, they are important.
Very well. Jeff.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that. I would just add that I think one of the challenges that the EU and NATO to a different degree face in the more competitive geopolitical environment is in seeing these countries through the prism of the relationship with Russia, which weakens some of the push to incentivize them as part of a path towards a European or transatlantic future. What I mean, I guess, is that I think there needs to be a greater focus on incentives and conditionality as part of the EU's, in particular the EU's relationships with these countries, that the degree and the quality and the depth of their cooperation and integration with Euro-Atlantic structures depends to a significant degree on their ability to actually do the things that move them more towards being rule of law based societies. A country like Georgia has made pretty significant steps in that direction, despite having a lot of problems. Ukraine has been sort of one step forward, two steps back, and faces now, potentially new rounds of political instability. But I think weakening the conditionality simply because these countries are in a vulnerable geopolitical position doesn't serve anybody's interest. That said, I would agree with James that at the end of the day, that issue is separate from the fundamental security and order issues that I talked about before, which is to say that you still, I think, are required or should, as a matter of principle, defend these countries' sovereignty and independence, which is not necessarily the same thing as giving them a glide path into institutions that they don't qualify to be members of on the merits.
Could I just
Please,
very briefly? One of the key differences here has to do with civil society and the civic impulse, which is impressively strong in Georgia, impressively strong in Ukraine. It's been building for a long time, but conspicuously weak in Russia. And this is another difference. Russia not only has a strong tradition of what they would call государственность, state-mindedness. Russia has an imperial legacy and imperial habits, and it has a very strong state culture. Ukraine and Georgia have weak state cultures, highly personalized and in many ways very fragile. But the civic element is exceptionally encouraging, and that's one factor that makes me, in the long term, very optimistic about Ukraine, as long as we can keep these other issues from upturning the apple cart.
Yes, and it seems to me that actually the question is rather to calibrate the extent of engagement and cooperation between, in this case, the EU and these countries, depending on the willingness of these countries to adopt and implement reforms, and therefore applying conditionality in more proportional ways, depending on the ownership of these reforms on the part of third countries. So, in a way, the sort of renewed neighborhood policy is more tailor-made, but it is not necessarily less centered on conditionality. It is more centered probably on a notion of phased conditionality or calibrated conditionality, depending on the engagement and willingness of interlocutors. Before opening up, of course, for your questions and comments, I have a final question that came to my mind, because given what you have described, given the assessment, the perception of this sort of structural gridlock and confrontation or divergence or disconnect between Russia, Europe, and the West, my question would be, what next? Is this a situation that we can live with indefinitely, that we are prepared to live with indefinitely? That will this become a, shall we say, protracted strategic standoff? So do we see years of gridlock or stalemate in front of us? Do we see the risk of a further deterioration? And again, this morning, and of course in many debates, the possibility of further conflicts, further crises is often evoked. So we see the scope for things getting actually even worse. Or do you see also the possibility of some stronger dialogue, some further engagement, some more constructive move with a view to managing what remains a difference, remains a strong difference, but nevertheless somehow has to be managed, and so the room for expanding the scope for dialogue? And what factors, in your view, could take us down the route, down one of these routes? Sort of continuity, things as they stand, degradation, or some degree of improvement in this situation? Perhaps, Jeff, if you...
Yeah, it's a big set of questions. I think we have to be prepared for this to be the new normal. I don't think anybody really wants for this to be the new normal. But if it is, in many ways, the West is better prepared for it than Russia is, certainly in terms of the resilience of our economies and the basic functioning of our institutions. Now, that's not to say we don't have a lot of problems, because we do, and I think we've seen them come to the forefront during some of our recent electoral campaigns in a number of countries. But nevertheless, I think if we're in a situation of protracted, I won't say conflict, but protracted confrontation with Russia, that is a scenario where the West is more likely to be successful over the longer term than Russia is. Now, that said, I don't think that's a situation that anybody really wants to be in. I mean, maybe there are some, but it is dangerous. I think that the potential for new crises is real. You know, the most recent major crisis emerged after the revolution in Ukraine. It's not like anybody was planning for a revolution to happen in Ukraine. It happened, and then people responded in different ways, and the end result was that there was this major crisis in the relationship. I think there are a number of flashpoints, many of them in this shared neighborhood, where you could have unpredictable developments that in various ways escalate into a larger crisis or standoff between the West and Russia. So managing those flashpoints, I think, will be very important. I think setting clear red lines and then enforcing them will be important. We've certainly had a credibility problem when it comes to that over the last several years, and I think Russia has taken advantage of uncertainty around where some of those red lines were. So sort of being clear about what it is that we will and will not accept, and backing up when we say we won't accept something with serious consequences is important to laying the foundation for dialogue. I don't think you can avoid dialogue. I was in a Track 2 event on Russia recently where somebody put it, you have to have a relationship with Russia. You can have a bad relationship with Russia, but you have to have a relationship with Russia. And I think that's right.
That's right.
There's no sort of getting out of the reality that Russia affects a lot of the issues that are central to American, European, and transatlantic security. The question is, how do you structure that dialogue? How do you make sure that the principles that you consider to be core to your interests and your security are respected as part of it? And I would argue that to do that, you need, again, to be clear about what it is that you're trying to achieve from that dialogue, be clear about what it is you will and won't accept, and you know, be willing to both impose consequences and walk away if it's not working in that direction.
So if I could sum up, it would be firmness as the basis for dialogue, in a way. Sure. James.
I think this will end in one of two ways. Either the West will become exhausted and fed up, and facts of one kind or another will be created, irrespective of what our principles are and what our wishes are. Or if we do the right thing, I think eventually, it's not going to be tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, we will reach a point in Russia we've reached before, where a core of this very pragmatic, self-interested elite comes to the conclusion that a lot of what they want is simply not possible, and that they're damaging much more fundamental interests by carrying on as they are. Now, if we want to get there, then I think we need a strategy with four components. One is rigorous containment, which means at the military end, and forgive me for introducing the NATO equation, it means persuading the Russians and the Russian defense establishment that a short war in Europe, which is the only war they think they can win, is simply not possible. There is no short war option with NATO. That's going to take real work. Secondly, we have to put our own house in order. And this is a lesson I know the UK government has finally drawn after the Skripal affair. We have to understand who is operating in our jurisdiction, who is operating in our financial system, and how they're doing it. And we have to be able to constrain and even block those who have harmful agendas. That is also very hard work. The third is, I think we have to be more robust in defending partners where it matters. I don't have time to elaborate what that means now, but apart from saying that from the beginning in 2014, I always felt the West policy vis-à-vis Ukraine, which should have been clearly communicated to Russia, is we will do everything to support Ukraine short of war. And we have never stated anything as clearly as that. And fourth, Jeff put the case for dialogue in the only way I would put it. But I would add to that, I think we need to restore the primacy of classical diplomacy, by which I mean something other than endless repetition of work in peace processes that are going nowhere. Classical diplomacy in the sense of purposeful, focused discussion, which has the aim of listening, clarifying, and warning, and integrating that with other tools of policy. And we have lost that. Paradoxically, the more we talk about dialogue, the less we do of that. And one part of what that means, my last comment, classical diplomacy means recognizing when you can compromise and when you need to, but it also means knowing when you have to walk out of the room. When a US Secretary of State is kept 3 hours by President Putin at the airport in Moscow, he has to know how to courteously say, I'm going back to Washington. When a British Foreign Secretary meets Lavrov for the first time and is showered with 20 minutes of abuse, he has to know courteously, diplomatically, how you say this meeting is at an end. That's diplomacy as well.
So a call for a revival of classical diplomacy as a tool for dialogue. Paul, any views on what's next?
Well, looking again from the EU perspective, and us being 28 member states, I would firstly really want to see that we're on the same page, and that we're clear about how we understand what's happening. And here, actually, James, I actually agree with you that there's been an increase in the sort of threat assessment. Let's say also the Spanish. You know, after a while, after they got to see that Russia gets involved there, that Russian planes fly next to Portugal, which you would think that's maybe not the most rational behavior from a Russian perspective to, let's say, well, appear as menacing to countries that historically have not been your adversaries. There has been increase in the threat assessment, but what I was trying to say was that the answer, the response to that threat is not necessarily the same from the US and from Europe, because from what I see, it's a collection of countries, many of them middle-sized or small, which do tend to think as middle-sized and small countries. And them coming together in many times does not lead to a strong and convincing message, but leads to the lowest common denominator. Now, in this case, in the case of sanctions, there has been, let's say, a little bit more ambitious than the one would have expected, but that sort of message, it's a lot about signaling, about the political message that you send. I would say even more importantly than about the money, about the sort of economic losses that you create on the other side. If in 1 week you put sanctions and then you have you know, big trade delegations or big summits, well, where's the message there? If I would be in President Putin's shoes, I would say, well, these people are just not serious. You know, they played this game, but at the same time, look, they want to do all these new trade deals. So about being on the same page and about sending really a clear message about what we want, what we expect from Russia, what is the cost, and what is the cost if things deteriorate, and what is actually the gain if things improve. So this sort of diversity among the Union, at least, let's say, preoccupies me as also the dialogue and coordination across the ocean.
Thank you very much, Paul. Well, the floor is open for your questions, your comments. We have not a huge amount of time, but a little bit to have a debate on some of these things that we've been discussing. Who would like to go first? We are tired after a long day. Sir. The button.
Press the button.
Yeah, Vladimir Cook, Moldovan mission to EU. I will not ask a question about Brexit this time. A question of a general nature. Do you believe that EU can become a geopolitical player, as US is, as Russia is, the way they play? Because when you talk to institutions, it's always denial. We never do geopolitical approach. We focus on benchmarks, action plans. When you talk to European Parliament, usually geopolitical approach is prevailing. When you talk to member states, it's somewhere in between. There are both of these elements are. So do you believe that in close future EU can become a geopolitical player who can actually let's say, have an objective and influence things, but also make big agreements with other geopolitical players, or it will continue the way it is? Thank you.
Just how would you define, in this case, a geopolitical player?
Geopolitical player like other, let's say...
a power like the others,
yes, yes,
so to speak.
Yes. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please, madam. Maybe on
Maybe
the other side.
the other side.
Pull it out.
The armrest.
Pull it out and press the button.
French diplomat.
Press the
We
button.
haven't actually, I was really just to follow up on the last question. There are 1,000 questions I could put, but the question of Europe being a major player, particularly given the departure of Brexit, basically, because as has been mentioned, it's the EU is composed of so many very small countries. That's one question I'm choosing. And a small supplementary question on Russia. It was noted that Russia did not intervene, as far as I understand, in the recent Armenian crisis, and I was wondering, can any significance be read into that? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Please, sir.
A button. There's a button in the armrest.
But there's no cable, so...
No, that is
Where's
just...
your cable?
Yeah. Maybe just go on.
You have another
You got
one.
another one.
Thank you.
Button.
Nils Janssons from the External Action Service. Can I ask of your projection regarding the unresolved conflicts? Many of the countries in the neighborhood are burdened with those and are held back by these conflicts, including in the strategic sense. Now, given the political context in Moscow and in Washington, any projection for addressing those situations? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that we have, in fact, three, broadly speaking, very interesting questions. This last one on protracted conflicts and approach to them, the question of Armenia and the recent political changes there, and Russia's positioning vis-à-vis those. And then the two questions combined of Europe becoming more of a geopolitical player, more of a full-fledged power in this theater and beyond. And as we discussed earlier in the course of the day, the potential impact also of Brexit in this perspective. James.
On the EU question, very quickly, it would require a mental revolution. And this is despite the fact that most EU members are NATO members, but the institutions are different, and they have their own working cultures that are very deep-seated. What I think is possible is that the EU reaches the point, and perhaps it is reaching the point, to paraphrase Trotsky, where it understands that you might not be interested in geopolitics, but geopolitics is interested in you. Okay. On the Armenian question, no, I don't think it's either surprising or significant, because geopolitically Armenia is, sadly, a country without choices. and Russia is its only source of protection. Cynically as Russia uses that position. And we've seen that now within the past few days, that these ties have been reaffirmed, and there's been calls from Yerevan for even having them strengthened. You asked a tricky question. All of these protracted conflicts are different, apart from the fact that Russia uses each of them to acquire an ability to destabilize and damage the cohesion of the larger metropolitan country. But to speak about what I know best, very briefly, about Donbass and the whole Minsk process, nothing will be done here or anywhere else as long as the approach of the Western powers is, let's go back to the meeting and keep taking the tablets and keep repeating our daily routine. The only provisions of the Minsk Accord which are clear, most of them are deliberately ambiguous, tortuous, contradictory, confusing. The only provisions that are clear are provisions that Russia has flagrantly violated from day one. And if you want to have a positive change, the way you would get it would be for the other Normandy partners to say, we are not going to turn up again to discuss trivia. We see no point in having further discussions at all until you in Moscow persuade us you have something real and new to say. That would change the dynamic enormously. Sitting around the negotiating table and repeating what has happened before is not going to do this. And I'll just repeat what Einstein has said. Stupidity is doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result.
I think insanity.
Did he say insanity? Oh, I thought insanity is more interesting than that. Sorry, yes. Okay.
Paul.
EU as a geopolitical actor. I would say that occasionally EU manages to be a geopolitical actor, most of the time a weak one. One that punches below the weight of what it could. Obviously, it depends. Let's say what's on the other side, with who it has to deal, and with what sort of issues it has to deal with. On some issues, it's more successful than in others. I wouldn't expect things to change dramatically, especially as you mentioned Brexit. Quite the opposite. It's clear that would lead to a weakening of the EU weight and EU's weight in foreign affairs. Protracted conflicts. Now, obviously, they're different, like was said, and they serve different purposes to Moscow. But I would say one purpose that has become even more clear in the last years since Ukraine is that they sort of create an interdiction zone for NATO enlargement, it blocks NATO enlargement to those countries. We have 5 out of the 6 countries in between the EU and Russia have protracted conflicts. I think for Russia they serve a clear role in that respect. So I would not expect major changes, as the general relations between Russia and the West will not change. So they would be useful tools even after, let's say, if relations would improve, because they have also obviously their internal influence role, military role in some cases, and so forth. And what was the third?
Perhaps Armenia?
Armenia. No, I mean, it's agreement. I don't think anybody expected any changes on that. The sort of geopolitical constraints that Armenia is in could hardly make us believe that a different scenario. We couldn't see a change in foreign policy, so Russia couldn't see it either. I think it was very clear from the very beginning, and they received the guarantees that basically nothing much will change in what concerns Russia's role. So.
Thank you, Paul. Jeff.
Okay. Briefly on the EU, again, I don't expect the EU itself to become a geopolitical actor, but hopefully as a result of the crises that it has faced around its borders over the last several years, there will be more of a kind of geopolitical consciousness, maybe this understanding that geopolitics might be interested in you. So understanding that things that the EU may want to do for moral or bureaucratic or other or economic reasons do in the real world have geopolitical consequences. And even if that's not what the EU is pursuing, that it has to take those geopolitical consequences into account in decision making. And I think the absence of that kind of geopolitical thinking contributed enormously to the failure to foresee what happened in eastern Ukraine. On Armenia, I don't disagree with anything that's been said. Armenia is a country that has a large Russian military and security presence, Russian domination of its economy. There's very little that the political revolution in that country could change. Mr. Pashinyan and his supporters also went out of their way to reassure the Russians that this wasn't about geopolitics in the way that, say, the colored revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine were. They weren't looking for a different foreign policy orientation. They just wanted political change within the country. So in that sense, no, I don't think it's surprising that there wasn't more overt kind of Russian involvement in the revolution there. And then on the broader question of protracted conflicts, I want to make 2 points here. One is that at the end of the day, this gets back to the original argument I was making about political order in Europe. As long as there's not an agreed framework for political order that these countries as well as Russia can fit into, there's no incentive for Russia to give up the leverage that it derives from maintaining those protracted conflicts. They're a tool for limiting the ability of existing Euro-Atlantic institutions to integrate the countries that are affected by it. And it is a way for Russia to turn the pressure up or down vis-a-vis Euro-Atlantic institutions as circumstances require. But the second point that I want to make, and I think this is worth emphasizing a little bit, is that people in these countries and in the de facto entities have agency too. And that even if you could resolve the bigger political order question, there's going to be a challenge to a greater or lesser degree in these countries of getting the people on the ground to agree to want to resolve these conflicts. And here I think there's a lot of differentiation among the different conflicts. In Moldova, Transnistria, there's a general acceptance that the end game is reintegration. The Transnistrian entity calls itself the Transnistrian Moldovan Republic. That's very different from the scenario that you have in a place like South Ossetia, where in particular, because of the ethnic cleansing that took place and the political and economic integration with Russia, there's very little support on the part of people on the ground for reintegration with Georgia. So even if there's a new Versailles Treaty, well, that's maybe a bad historical example, but a new, big agreement between...
Congress of Vienna.
Yeah, if there's a new Vienna Congress and Russia is somehow reintegrated, I think you would have a hard time persuading the people on the ground in South Ossetia to want to go back to being part of a Georgian state. And the same goes for Crimea, frankly.
I'm not sure about that, but...
Donbass is different, but I think Crimea is...
We have come at 5 minutes from the end of this debate and conference. Perhaps I could ask the speaker for the last 1 minute each, 1 minute each thought on final comment or proposal that you want to offer to close this very interesting debate. James, do you want to start? 1 minute.
Less than a minute. Sounds like a cliche. Strategic patience. Unfortunately, the great British public, most of the British electorate have the attention span of a gnat, and I think that's true for a large number of other electorates, and this is very worrying. And part of what that means is understanding there's certain conflicts that are necessary. They are, to use Russian Hegelian language, historically necessary. We have to learn how to live with them in a mature way, which doesn't mean rail against them and moralize, but just accept why they are there and try to develop a kind of a safe and mature relationship in the midst of this. But if there's going to be strategic patience, you need to have a strategy as well as patience. And we haven't always had that. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Jeff?
I would second that, both the need for strategy and the need for patience. I think patience is a perpetual challenge in a lot of our countries, but the lack of strategy is a bigger problem in some ways. I think we haven't quite figured out, given that the paradigm we've been operating under since the 1990s no longer seems operative, what's going to replace it. And that is a conversation that needs to happen both within our countries and at the transatlantic level. And the only other thing I would put out there is that a lot of work needs to happen domestically in the United States, in Europe, around issues related to resiliency of political systems, resiliency of financial systems, resiliency of media and populations. And this doesn't necessarily need to be done only because of Russia. I think we need to do this. We need to focus on enforcing things like disclosure of beneficial ownership, financial transparency in real estate and other kinds of financial transactions, because they're good from a governance perspective within our own countries. They help throw light on and weaken the hold of corruption and corrupt individuals, whether those individuals are based in Russia, Ukraine, the Gulf, anywhere else. But there are a lot of built-in incentives that make it hard for politicians in our countries to do that. And I think this is a real security challenge, and it's something that I think our political systems and political elites need to start taking more seriously.
Resilience. Paul?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, patience was mentioned, but I would also add focus. And if, let's say, I constructively criticize the EU, I would say that focus is needed also on the other side of the Atlantic. Just to give an example, also linking to the previous panel, we do have sanctions on Russia. At the same time, we give up the Iran deal, the price of oil goes up, and nowadays Russia makes 100 million euros per day extra because the price of oil went up. So considering, let's say, the consequences of our decision in the various theaters would also be welcomed. And also in the EU, I mean, focusing, we talk so much if we should keep the sanctions or not, but we almost forgot why are they in place. We forgot that actually we had the first breach of the borders of a country since the Second World War, first situation in which a country goes and annexes the territory of another country. Now, if there's something more basic in international law than territorial integrity, I don't know what it is. So keeping the focus on why we have the policy that we have and on what we want to achieve through that policy.
Why and what? Very well. I think that we have come to the end of yet another very interesting panel discussion. Like in the previous one, is not necessarily sparkling with optimism as to the prospects for dealing with the crisis and the issues that we have at hand, but acknowledging some of the problems, the difficulties, the sort of enduring nature of the standoff that we face within the European security order, and the need to adjust to that. Firmness has been mentioned, need for dialogue based on that has been mentioned, need to strengthen resilience within Europe, and of course need to work with partners and support their reforms. So I should thank very, very much our speakers for having shared their views with us so generously. And I am also at the same time bringing this conference to an end. This has been a long day. We have tried to address a lot of issues on the transatlantic agenda and more broadly on the agenda of international security affairs these days. I think that we have managed to provide a number of perspectives. We have been glad to cooperate with the United States mission to the EU towards this event. And I would also very, very warmly wish to thank my colleagues who have been working very, very hard to organize this conference, and Liz, Marta, Emmanuel, Mark, Rebecca, Matteo, Paul, of course, and many others. Really, thank you very much for your effort. I think that at the end of the day, we had a very worthwhile debate. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the exchange. And we look forward from an EPC standpoint to continue these debates and look at very, very difficult issues which are on the transatlantic agenda and at the need for a dialogue in addressing them. Thank you very much for your attention.